Right, so Max Planck was an incredible scientist. Everyone in Germany loved hearing him speak, and he toured the country giving talks about his day. But his chauffeur, on the other hand, got pretty tired of hearing the same speech day after day. So he finally asked, Max, can I give this next speech? I've heard it so many times, I'm pretty sure I've memorized it. Max agreed and let the chauffeur give his speech. He took a seat at the front and popped on the chauffeur's hat, while the chauffeur pretended to be Max and played the part perfectly. The speech was a success. At the end, a man stood up and asked a question. His response, "That's such a simple question. I'm surprised he'd even ask. I'll let my chauffeur answer it." Now, the point of this story isn't to show how quick-witted the chauffeur is, but actually to show us that there's two different types of knowledge. There's the deep knowledge that Max had, and then there's the sort of surface-level knowledge that the chauffeur had. So whenever we're trying to learn something, really the point is that we want to develop a deep understanding of the topic, and that's what I want to talk about today. Right, so the first thing that we need to do basically involves learning how to learn, which kind of involves creating a learning roadmap. And this learning roadmap will help us to determine what do we need to learn, as well as how do we learn that stuff too. In short, before we learn anything, we should be asking ourselves 3 questions. First, why do we actually want to learn the subject? Like, what is the motivation? So this could be extrinsic motivation, in other words, we are excited by the possible reward from doing well in the topic, like getting a first-class degree, or it can be an intrinsic motivation, which is a motivation where we find it personally rewarding to do well, and we find it kind of enjoyable just to study that topic. Now, there's no real right or wrong type of motivation. What really matters is understanding what motivates us so that we can continue to do well when things get difficult. Second, what do we actually need to learn? Now, the objective here is really to build a high-level overview of everything that we need to learn over the coming weeks and months. So one thing that I quite like to do is to scope the subject. In other words, I write down the topic on a piece of paper, then I break down that topic into all the relevant subtopics. This allows me to see the big picture of everything that I'm going to study, as well as sort of see the relationship between different topics. And this is super important because the way that our brain works is to associate new knowledge with stuff that we've already learned. For example, if someone told us that 1 + 1 = 2, but we have no idea what numbers are, we can't learn. It's impossible to do the equation. We have to understand that this symbol is associated with a number in order to learn that thing. We have to have association in order to learn. Finally, we need to ask ourselves, how do I learn it? So by this point, we should have a pretty good understanding of everything that we need to study, but we now need a process and a strategy for learning that stuff properly. So in this video, I really want to show you my own meta-learning model for learning pretty much anything. The problem that I found when trying to learn pretty much anything is that I'll do anything but focus on the task at hand. Like, for some reason, I'll do anything but work, even when I know that's highly irrational. So the solution then is to find strategies to confront 3 main obstacles. First, procrastination. As you know, it's way too easy to just fall into this infinity pool where we're just scrolling through Twitter or checking out Instagram and things like that. And so what I found is that the best way to counteract this problem and basically get on with our work is to use a simple trick, which is known as the 10-minute rule. The idea here is that whenever we find ourselves procrastinating, we give ourselves 10 minutes to do the thing that we're procrastinating from. No more, no less. So we just sit down, do the thing for 10 minutes, and that's it. And usually what I find is that by sitting down and doing the thing for 10 minutes, that gives me enough momentum to keep going and keep working. Second, distraction. Our environment, the difficulty of the task, and our own emotions can all get in our way of actually learning something properly. So in an ideal world, we'd create our environment in a way that would optimize our focus. And one brilliant way to do this is to use something known as pre-commitments, which basically help us to eradicate a future choice that may sort of distract us. So for example, let's say that I get distracted by social media, I would just block all social media apps whenever I'm working. Or let's say that I get distracted by notifications on my phone, I simply put my phone in another room. That is how I use pre-commitments to stop getting distracted. Thirdly, optimization. Now, Yerkes Dodson law tells us that we tend to perform better with a slight increase in stress and pressure up to a certain point. Clearly, there's a load of different factors at play when it comes to this rule, but the idea is that whenever we're trying to learn something, we need to make sure that our arousal state is correct. So for example, if we are trying to learn from a textbook, a quieter or low arousal environment is going to be better than a very noisy high arousal environment. But if we're, a pro athlete, in those circumstances, a higher stress, a higher arousal environment is going to be better for us. So whenever we're trying to focus and learn something, we need to make sure the environment is at the correct arousal level. So by this point, we should be really good at actually focusing on the task. But how can we actually make sure that we're using this focus time appropriately? The key is to optimize our learning for active practice rather than passive learning. Sure, there's no avoiding the textbooks and the theory when we start learning something, and this is a great way to build a solid foundation of knowledge. But if we really want to learn something, we need to switch to active practice as early as possible. Like, let's say our goal is to get stronger. We can read all the best textbooks about the best bench press technique, and we can have all the theory in the world, but if we don't actually go out there and lift the weights, we're not going to get any stronger. So what techniques then can we use to include deliberate practice into our studies? Well, one great way that we can do this is to use projects. Now, projects are so much better than textbooks and lectures because they force us to create some sort of result which requires us to have a deep understanding of the topic. So for example, if you're doing a law degree, I'd highly recommend getting involved in the Innocence Project because this requires you to have a deep understanding of criminal law and you're working towards a very serious end goal, which is to overturn wrongful convictions. Secondly, challenge yourself. Now, this is related to the previous point, but the idea here is that we want to be using our knowledge in an environment which requires the deepest and highest proficiency of that particular topic. So if we're trying to master an instrument, it makes sense to get involved with the university orchestra. Or if we're trying to get better at international law, it makes sense to get involved with the Jessup International Moot. All of this stuff pushes us to understand the topic far better than everyone else. Finally, we've got this idea of combinatory play, and really the point of this is that we want to take two or more seemingly unrelated topics and we want to get really, really good at both of them. So, for instance, when I was studying law, I also decided to get pretty good at maths. Well, I mean, not amazing, but I've put some time and effort into learning maths, and that whole process helped me to structure my essays in a more logical and coherent manner. So really, our deliberate practice doesn't need to be solely focused on the thing we're actually trying to learn, because there is a certain level of overlap between all the different skills that we're trying to get good at. So yeah, have fun. As we study, we'll probably notice that there are areas that we just don't understand that well. And you know what? That is totally okay. The important point is that we're able to isolate those weaknesses and concentrate intensively on them. And by doing this, we help to unlock areas of learning that help to sort of, help us make further progress and deepen our overall understanding of the topic. For example, back at law school, I had a bunch of different topics that I really wasn't that strong at. One of these topics was internal markets in European Union law. So if you asked me back then, what is Article 34 and 35 of the Treaty of the Function of the European Union, I'd be like, I have no idea, don't throw me under the bus like that. But because I knew that was a weakness, I was able to drill that topic intensively, and now that topic is plugged. I now know that thing pretty well, and if that question came up in an exam, I'd be super, super happy. So the question I keep asking myself whenever I'm learning something is, if the exam or test were tomorrow, what would I be least happy about coming up? And whatever the answer is the thing that I study and drill intensively. This is a really good exercise because whenever we're learning, it's super tempting to learn the stuff that we're familiar with or good at and not actually look or address our weaknesses. But really, the learning only happens when we are addressing our weak links and focusing on improving those and operating at a certain level of difficulty. So by drilling down into those weaknesses, we're really helping to deepen our understanding of any topic. One thing that surprises me a lot is that people tend to forget that the whole point of learning is to actually retain that information. So when we're learning something, we want to use a process that's going to encode that information into our brain to make it easier to recall whenever we need that knowledge next time. There are broadly 3 strategies that we need to use to make sure this happens. Firstly then, self-testing. Reading, underlining, highlighting and things like that are super passive ways of learning and aren't going to help us to retain and recall that information later. So ideally, we want to be using a learning method where we're answering questions and actively trying to recall that information over time using things like flashcards. The process of trying to retrieve information not only helps us to commit that stuff to memory, but also helps us to identify our weak links. In other words, we identify our weaknesses where we can't actually answer those questions, and we know those are the particular areas of the topic that we need to study a little more. Secondly, we've got spaced repetition. So whenever we're trying to learn anything, we shouldn't just try to learn it in one go, but we should try to space out the learning of that thing over a period of time. So if we're trying to learn a piece on the piano, we shouldn't just learn it all in one day, but we should break it across a number of different practice sessions. This is based on something known as Ebbinghaus's forgetting curve, which I've talked about so much before. But basically the idea here is that the more that we revisit and look at a certain topic, the stronger our neural pathways will be, meaning it's easier to recall and retrieve that information at a later date. Finally, we have this concept of overlearning, and really the idea here is that whenever we're trying to learn something, we shouldn't just stop at the point where we're semi-proficient at it. We should get to a point where we're above and beyond what is actually required of us. For example, it's easy just to learn from the lecturer and the textbook and decide, you know what, I've learned the topic pretty well, it's time to move on. But instead, if we want to deeply understand a topic, we need to overlearn. We need to identify the grey areas of the topic, we need to look at the journal articles, we need to actually think critically about the topic that we're learning. Okay, so after some time, we're going to be pretty good at whatever it is that we're trying to learn. But there's always going to be room for improvement. And this is why it's so important for us to get feedback. This helps us to understand whether what we've learned and how we've applied it is correct. One of the best ways that I found to get more feedback is to put myself in more real-world situations. So, for example, if I were trying to get better at practicing and writing essays, I would write more essays and post them online, or I would talk about them in a YouTube video, or I would just give them to my lecturer. And I found that the more exposure I can get of other people to my work, the better and more varied that feedback is going to be. Importantly, the type of feedback that we want is corrective feedback. In other words, we don't just want someone to tell us what is wrong, but we also want them to tell us how to actually fix it. And this is why getting feedback from an expert like a lecturer or someone who's just like 1 or 2 steps ahead of us is so much better than just getting feedback from anyone. Firstly, ask the question, in what ways do you see me holding myself back? People who know us well can expose our blind spots, they can point out habits and behaviours and other stuff that are holding us back from making progress. Like, if we are consistently structuring our essay poorly, we may not be able to see that, but someone who's consistently read our essays over a long period of time may be able to see that instead. Secondly, I would ask them, on a scale of 1 to 10, how would you rate blank? So really, whenever we're trying to get feedback, we often want to try and get feedback on a very specific thing that we're trying to improve on. So for instance, if I'm trying to write more persuasively, I may ask the person, on a scale of 1 to 10, how would you rate my persuasiveness or my clarity of argument or something like that? So yeah, always ask for feedback because it always helps to get another pair of eyes on your progress. Finally, and to bring things around full circle, we only really know a subject when we develop a deep and detailed understanding of the ideas and principles we're trying to learn. Broadly then, there are 2 different ways that we can deepen our knowledge of a subject. Firstly, let yourself struggle. We shouldn't shy away from the hard parts of any subject. Like, if we're trying to struggle to wrap our head around a certain principle or topic or idea, we should just keep plugging away at it until we understand it. And this will really help to deepen our understanding of that topic. So the way that I quite like to do this is that if I'm struggling with a particular topic or idea, is that I'll break it down into more manageable steps. So if I'm struggling with the idea of assault in criminal law, I'll break it down first into its definition, which is an intentional act which directly causes the claimant to reasonably apprehend the application of unlawful force, and then I will try to understand each component step of that definition. Secondly, and finally, challenge your understanding. Sometimes we think we know a topic well, but as soon as we try to verbalize it or actually write it down, we don't really understand it that well. So always ask yourself, do I really understand this thing? Could I explain it to someone else if they ask me what this thing is? And so the more that we challenge ourselves to see whether or not we actually understand something, the more we're able to figure out our weaknesses and develop and deepen our knowledge of that topic. So as a final thought, remember that there are 2 types of knowledge. One is plank knowledge, and these are the people that have real knowledge. They have paid their dues and they have the aptitude. And then there's chauffeur knowledge. These are the people that look impressive, they act like they know what they're doing, they talk the talk, but deep down, they have no idea what they're really doing. Real learning and knowledge comes from deeply understanding a topic and putting in the work.